I appreciate the opportunity to be the closer for today for the last presentation. Of course, we'll have some question and answers afterwards, but the majority of this webinar is nearly over, so those of you who have been sitting patiently and waiting for this riveting section, hopefully I will not disappoint. So thank you for joining me as we discuss how LabKey deployed the MyStudies application in a compliant manner. While our requirements dictated a compliant environment, as you've certainly heard from some of the questions and other use case opportunities, you don't necessarily have to use or deploy into a compliant environment. So you could certainly deploy this on-premise in a test environment or other use cases, for example. So in our case, we had numerous compliance requirements that we had to deal with. There's HIPAA, FSMA, CFR Part 21 CFR Part 11, for example, and all of these compliance requirements are primarily objective focused, and so they kind of leave the how-to to that part of figuring out on yourself. And so as you dig a little deeper, trying to figure out what does all of these requirements require, you're often referred to the NIST Special Publication 800-53. But unfortunately, compliance is not as simple as a check mark or a checkbox that you can just click. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the NIST 853 special publication document is a measly 462 pages that you need to boil down and sift through in order to determine what you have to do in order to implement a compliant environment. So while we would like it to be as simple as a checkbox, unfortunately, it looks a little bit more like this, which is a jumbled mess of standards, technologies, and processes to follow, and a myriad of tools to implement. And before you know it, your head starts spinning, and you might end up with an overwhelming sense of dread. And before you know it, you're staring down the Death Star of compliance. And so those are just the things that you need to consider before you even look at the application. So let's take a look at the application and some of the things that we need to consider as well. So on the surface, when we look at a simple block diagram like this, where we've got 3 servers and a mobile app and some patient data and some third parties that are accessing the data in regards to collecting the data from the and integrating it with their environment. It morphs quickly into another more complex diagram, which we've seen today, where we have our mobile app users and we have our research organization, and you have the study analyst coordinating the study. And then that morphs into a more complex diagram, which is this is the diagram that we use to deploy in our cloud environment. And what's challenging about this particular aspect of this diagram is that every box and arrow on this diagram is essentially a security enforcement point that you must consider. So how do you address that? How do you address the compliance Death Star? As well as, now that you've got your application, what do I need to consider? And how do I get there? Well, there's hope. And that hope comes in the form of automation. So as LabKey built out the MyStudies platform, it became clear to us that while it was possible to deploy the environment manually, it became clear that if we did that, it would be increasingly burdensome to maintain that environment over time. So we considered automation. While the initial effort to automate is higher, the deployment benefits that you get with risk mitigation and maintain the environment decreases over time. If you contrast that with a manual deployment, you have a lower initial amount of effort, but as time increases and the burden of maintaining that environment increases, as you get new operating system patches or new releases of the software and all of those things, you have a risk of configuration drift, and maintaining the environment becomes challenging over time. And those higher risks translate directly into higher security risks. And compliance is all about reducing your risk mitigation. So what are the keys to addressing the compliance requirements Death Star? In our approach, we have 3 pillars. Our approach includes design, automation, and defense. For design, we use a tiered application approach that separates the web application tier from the database tier. In addition, we use network segmentation to isolate each MyStudies application server from each other. Next, we implemented encryption everywhere, at the operating system layer, at the database layer, at the file layer, and at the transport layer. And yes, as some of the questions came in earlier, our system does include encryption at rest. And lastly, we created a comprehensive list of network protocols and ports that are used by the application so that we can limit the network traffic to only those that are used by the application. Once we had a design, we implemented various automation tools. We automated the provisioning of the cloud services, and we used that automation to enforce the security design. We then used configuration management tools to declare and enforce the configurations for the applications. This approach prevents configuration drift and allows us to stay in compliance over the long haul. Next, we implemented automation for testing of the security controls to validate that our deployment matches the security control design. And lastly, we implemented automation to get us out of the patch and dependency update nightmare. We leveraged our tooling and our cloud capabilities to implement a blue-green model. Rather than patch in place, blue-green allows us to deploy a new instance of each of the applications and cut over to it versus patching it in place. This approach minimizes the risk of long-term outages due to a failed patch or application upgrade, as well as it allows us to audit the environment with each deployment. So let's take a little bit deeper look at the automation tooling that we used. Our automation consists of 4 steps: provision, configure, audit, and monitor. We use Terraform in step 1, the provisioning step, to instantiate the cloud infrastructure. In this step, we create the virtual private cloud, the base operating system instances for the application servers, and we configure the security controls. In step 2, we use Chef as a configuration management application to configure the operating system and the applications. In step 3, the audit step, we use Inspect, AWS Inspector, and Waza to audit the application deployment to ensure that it meets the security design. At this point, the application is fully deployed and running. In step 4, the monitoring step, we use Splunk, Waza, and CloudWatch to monitor the applications to ensure that they're running and that the environment is not tampered with. I should say that all of these tools that we are using here are either cloud service tools or open source tools that are available. Our third pillar is defense. You need a strong defense to protect the environment and patient data, especially with all of the flavor of the week or security breaches of the week that seem to be occurring. On the front end, we use a web application firewall to reduce the risks of attack from botnets, known malicious actors, malware, cross-site scripting, and SQL injection attacks. We use various intrusion detection tools to detect and prevent intrusion, including log aggregation and monitoring tools to aid in the consolidation of event logs, along with various vulnerability scanning tools to detect vulnerabilities. Using this approach of design, automation, and defense, we're able to organize our Death Star of compliance obligations into something much closer to a compliance checkmark. So I'd like to share with you some lessons learned that we learned through the process with some do's and don'ts. I'll start with the don'ts. Number one, as you've heard me mention already, don't deploy the platform manually, certainly not in a compliance environment, because that's generally a recipe for failure and more work later on. Number two, don't forget about backups, data retention, and data recovery plans. While I didn't talk about them today, these are important components for any compliance solution. And likewise, number three on the don't side, don't forget about the important processes and procedures. While I didn't cover it today, you really need a strong change management process, security and incident management processes, along with a comprehensive compliance policies, procedures, SOPs, and documentation package. All of those are important components to your compliance solution. On the do side, do design and consider and plan for future changes. If you start with a rigid design that does not take into account future changes, you're just going to make your future work more difficult. So for a simple example of that, instead of numbering your network access control lists and your firewall rules sequentially, like starting with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., if you just use a different numbering methodology, such as rule number 10, and next rule is number 20, number 30, and leaving a gap in there allows you to insert new rules later on without having to refactor your automation. Something simple as that is an easy lesson that helps you save time and improve your aspect of deployment later on. Number two on the do side, do consider using the cloud service provider. Cloud providers give you access to more tooling and likely more tools than you have on premise. In addition, cloud service providers have a shared responsibility model that allows you to take advantage of those systems and tools that they offer and shed that responsibility to maintain those tools to them. And that allows you to focus only on your aspects of the compliance picture. And as I've already shared, investing in automation has significant rewards to enforce, audit, and validate the design controls. And lastly, use encryption everywhere. It's the law, it's the requirements, and this day and age, the technologies exist. You just have to do it and use it everywhere. So in closing, I really like this quote as it's quite true about compliance. It's not only about what you do that you're held responsible for, but also for what you do not do, or perhaps maybe what you failed to do. And while it's difficult to convey the complexity and details of a compliant deployment, I trust that this presentation has given you some tips on how to start your deployment of the MyStudies system. Thank you for your time today, and we'll be happy to answer your questions you might have.